Such is a plain statement of the facts which brought about this great catastrophe, freed from particulars which certain historians have added in induction to the principal fact, and which they have explained, not always with justice. I have only related what in the sphere of my duties I saw and learned. It does not behoove me to set myself up as the judge of Napoleon's conduct in an enterprise the object of which, as must perforce be admitted, was eminently a national one, if the legality of the means employed did not correspond to the grandeur of the scheme. It remains proved that, in the Bayonne transaction, Napoleon was impelled by the interests of France far more than by any other motive, and that the change of dynasty was only the consequence of and an accessory to the system which he wished to establish in Spain. The forcible act essayed in the peninsula has been explained as caused by a fixed determination on the part of Napoleon to remove the Bourbons from every throne in Europe. But that was only a secondary idea with him. It was rather the state of Spain that awoke his solicitude. Spain, whose prosperity was as important to France as to the country itself, which was the continuation of our soil, was in a state of decay, which would inevitably have led to her falling in easy prey to England. The future was not in Napoleon's hands. However much the Spanish government might at that time be subjected to his wishes, this government had nonetheless desired to join the coalition on the eve of the Battle of Jena. As long as Napoleon should reign, this government would not dare to betray him. But would it be the same with the emperor's successors? The servile submission of this royal family showed the master of France how foolhardy and dangerous it would be to rely on such princes. The Spanish government placed its ships, troops, and feeble resources at Napoleon's disposal at this moment and without hesitation, in spite of certain secret communications with England suspected by the emperor, but which had remained without any immediate result. France had not a sufficiently strong motive to declare war with Spain and to expel the Bourbons by force. This line of action, had it been justifiable by apparent causes, would have been worthier of Napoleon, but he could not adopt it in the absence of any plausible motive without exciting public reprobation. Louis XIV, acting in a dynastic interest, had been admirably served by Charles II's testament. Napoleon, prompted by a national interest, failed. He had no choice of means. He remains exposed to the blame of posterity, which would have absolved him if his work, the defects of which showed themselves owing to its want of success, had been able to last and to bring with it the many benefits which would have resulted for France and Spain. This enterprise would have succeeded, as did the War of Succession, if the coalition had not deprived Napoleon of the time and the possibility of applying his strength and his attention to it, by constantly drawing him on to new struggles, which removed him from the object in view. The national resistance and antipathy even would have been overcome in the end. The influence of men enlightened as to the real interests of their country would have prevailed, and the masses would have followed them. The advantages of the Constitution of Bayonne, the prosperity which its application would have conferred on the people, the protection which the French alliance would have assured to our neighbors by the interest we had to render them prosperous and powerful, all these causes together would in time have subjugated the Spaniards. Napoleon can be blamed in this matter neither for precipitation nor for caprice. His plan had been matured and carried out with the necessary slowness and prudence. He had in his favor his omnipotence, the prosperous state of France, Europe at that time pacified, and a close alliance with Russia. The moment seemed favorable. It was neither too late nor too early. Napoleon himself had said that he was forced to seize the opportunity offered to him by fortune to regenerate Spain, to remove her from the clutches of England, and to unite her closely to our system. In doing so, he was, in his opinion, laying one of the fundamental bases of the repose and security of Europe. The illegality, however, of the means employed was the frequent subject of Napoleon's reflections and maintained him in a continual state of perplexity. His mind revolted against perfidious conduct, for he had an instinctive loathing for crooked and tortuous ways. He hesitated for a long time between various lines of action. He had thought of a family alliance, but nothing is more precarious than a political marriage. Another plan was to take, in guise of pledges, the Spanish provinces on this side of the Ebro, but that would have deeply offended the inhabitants of these provinces and would have kept them continually ready to revolt. He was forced to go back to the plan of dethroning the reigning family. The events that crowded on disposed of the emperor's resolutions. An outraged father, supplanted by his son, abandoned by his people, urged on by a fear for his own safety, by the necessity of having recourse to the protection of his ally, and by the fear with which the violence of the factions inspired him. A guilty son, vile and nerveless, dominated by evil passions, both came to throw themselves into Napoleon's arms. This combination of extraordinary circumstances, the news of the Madrid insurrection, which had been encouraged by Ferdinand, an insurrection the course of which Frenchmen had been massacred in the hospitals and in the streets, all these things together urged the emperor on. When he saw the Spanish princes at his feet, and he had gauged their worthlessness and weakness, Napoleon considered himself an instrument of Providence. The scandalous scenes which he witnessed amongst the members of this family deprived him of all confidence in the stability of an alliance with these princes. The old king refused to return to Spain. Could Napoleon, even if he had been so disposed, force this prince to resume his crown? King Charles's antecedents, his impotence, the aversion which he had provoked through his favorite, made the emperor see only too clearly that such a restoration was not practicable. Should Ferdinand then have been sent back to Madrid? But that would have meant handing Spain over to England and to the parties which were hostile to France. Napoleon confirmed his resolution in consequence to confide the destinies of the neighboring kingdom into the hands of a Frenchman. The generous wish to rescue so interesting a nation from the state of decay to which it had been reduced by the government of a degenerate race of kings had as much to do in forming Napoleon's resolutions as the necessity of putting an end to a line of policy vacillating in the present and certain to be hostile in the future. The emperor sent a pressing invitation by courier to King Joseph to come to Bayonne. In the interview which he had with his brother at Venice in 1807, Napoleon had spoken to him of the various chances which might be brought about by the dissensions of which the Spanish reigning house was divided, but without expressing any definite idea on the subject at the time. Napoleon went to meet the King of Naples, Joseph, on his arrival at Bayonne, informed him of the views he entertained concerning him, and urged him to agree to them. He had hoped that Lucien would have accepted the conditions which he wished to impose on him at Mantua. If Lucien had been more docile under his demands, Napoleon would at this time have placed him on the throne of Naples, which was given to Murat, the Grand Duke of Berg. Whilst awaiting the arrival of his brother Joseph, Napoleon occupied himself with providing that the Spanish colonies should remain faithful to their allegiance. With this object in view, he had sent out from the various ports of Spain, Portugal, and France a number of light ships freighted with arms and munitions and carrying proclamations to the ports of Southern America. The emperor also ordered reports on the state of the Spanish finances, army, and navy to be laid before him, and gave orders that a subsidy of 25 millions taken from the funds of the extraordinary domain should be advanced to the Spanish treasury to meet the most pressing needs of the country. And finally, he ordered the dispersion of the Spanish troops in the peninsula and the distribution of the French soldiers over various parts of the territory at the points where they were most needed to be in readiness to check the first attempts at insurrection. Napoleon had understood that a change of dynasty could not be effected without the intervention in some form of the Spanish nation. And that is the reason why he desired to convoke to Bayonne an assembly of leading men in the various classes of the state. He introduced his brother Joseph to the most influential men, who all offered him their services and hailed him as the regenerator of their country. The result of this assembly of Spanish notables was a constitution which contained all the elements of the regeneration of Spain. If the fanaticism of the monks who had a representative in each family, if the influence exercised by the greatness and too generous exaltation of the national feeling of self-respect had not annulled the benefits of this constitution, Spain would today have been far advanced on the road to prosperity, which the constitution drawn up at Bayonne opened out before her feet. Whilst the deliberations of the junta were proceeding, Charles IV, the Queen, and the Prince de la Paix left for Fontainebleau. The infants, followed by the Duc de San Carlos and Canon Escoquets, were sent to the valley of Valençay, which had been selected by the emperor as the residence of these princes. Taken by surprise and dragged on by the rapidity with which events had crowded on, Napoleon had only just the time to send word to the Prince de Benevento, Talleyrand, to whom this estate belonged, and who had remained in Paris, to proceed to Valençay to receive the infants. King Joseph passed from the throne of Naples to the throne of Spain, and the Grand Duke of Berg went to take his place in Naples. The Grand Duchy of Berg, left vacant by Murat, was united to the French Empire and was given in 1810 to the eldest son of Prince Louis, after the latter had abdicated and renounced the crown of Holland. This business having been disposed of, the emperor, accompanied by the empress, left Murat to return to Paris. He spent a day at Pau and at Tarbes. At Pau, he occupied the castle where Henri IV was born. This castle, situated at a distance of 1,000 yards from the town, had since been restored and had become an imperial residence. At Tarbes, the emperor slept at the prefect's mansion, where he noticed, in one of the drawing rooms, a fine portrait of Lay, the celebrated opera singer, one of the glories of the department. Napoleon only spent 12 hours at Auch, hearing that General de Solis, who had refused to fill the functions of chief of the staff to General Lannes at Bologna, was living in the neighborhood. Retired in a country house, he charged Prince de Neuchâtel Berthier to offer him a post. General de Solis had disapproved of the condemnation of Moreau, and without expressing his discontent, had found some pretext for retiring from the service. He had been chief of the staff to this celebrated general. He had filled the same post in the army in Hanover, when this army was under the command of the Prince de Pontecorvo, and had even commanded it during the marshal's absence. General de Solis had grown to hate the emperor with a hidden hatred during these two campaigns, a hatred which he had dared not to make public, but which burst out with violence in 1814. Napoleon, who admired this general officer's talent, had no hesitation in making the first advances. He entrusted him with the command of a division in Spain. General de Solis asked to be recalled after some time. This inconstancy of humor, or rather this hidden ill will, did not exhaust the emperor's patience, and at the time of the expedition to Russia, he appointed the general chief of the staff to Prince Eugene. After the taking of Smolensk, de Solis once more asked to be allowed to leave the army on the pretext of bad health. He was present in Paris in 1814, at the time of the entry of the Allies. It is known how he behaved. The stay of the emperor and the empress for 2 days at Toulouse, their journey at Montauban and Agen, were marked by the wild enthusiasm which Napoleon's presence excited everywhere. His apparition was always followed by measures calculated to increase the prosperity of the towns and provinces which he visited. Madame de Balby, an old friend of the Comte de Provence, who afterwards became Louis XVIII, happened to be at Montauban at the time. I had occasion to see her in Paris after the Restoration, and to hear her boast before me of having been an honorable exception to the general joy which was manifested at Montauban at the time of Napoleon's visit. Whilst the emperor was pursuing his way through the departments of the south, the insurrection in Spain had become general. The news of the double abdication of Charles IV and of Ferdinand and King Joseph's proclamation had brought about an explosion of the feelings of hatred, which only wanted an opportunity to burst out. In the space of a week towards the end of May, the east, north, and west of Spain were on fire. The Spaniards had risen as one man. The arsenals had been ransacked. The people had armed. Juntas had been formed, and a mass levy was being organized on every side. The mob took the initiative everywhere and imposed its umbrageous and savage authority. In the chiefs who were in authority, it saw none but traitors. Most of the captains general were murdered because they refused blind obedience to the riotous passions of the mob. The least hesitation was punished with a cruel death. Enlightened men, both military and civil, who feared reprisals from France and who, satisfied with the fall of a shameful government, looked for the reform of abuses and the benefits of a government which was anxious to cause its usurpation to be forgotten, essayed to calm the fury of the mob. They fell victims to their own wisdom and patriotism. The furious mob pursued them into refuges most worthy of respect, murdering them in the arms of their own soldiers or of their own families. Their bodies were dragged through the mud. Their heads were carried at the end of pikes. The remnant of the French fleet, which had escaped the disaster of Trafalgar, had taken refuge in the port of Cadiz. When this insurrection broke out, this feeble squadron, having lost all hope of being rescued by General Dupont's corps, hemmed in by the English and Spaniards, was obliged to surrender at discretion to the latter to escape destruction without revenge. The fury of the Spanish mob kept increasing, and they excited the rioters to treat our unhappy prisoners with the refinement of unheard of ferocity. They crucified some of these wretched soldiers to trees. Others were hung up and fires were lighted beneath their feet. Others were buried alive. Some were sawn. I can't even read it. The pen refuses to record the acts of horrible and inhuman barbarism which these cannibals indulged in towards their unfortunate victims. Women and children were treated with the most abominable cruelty. It was whilst at Bordeaux that the emperor heard the sad news of the capitulation of Baylen. The dishonorable conditions of this capitulation, the unworthy conduct of the Spanish generals, who, not satisfied with insulting them, had refused bread and water to our soldiers, who were dying of hunger and who were choking under the burning and implacable sun. All this desolating news filled Napoleon with indignation and grief. These feelings reached their highest pitch when he heard how horribly the ferocious mob had treated those of our soldiers whom it could not kill, pursuing them all along the roads with stones and knives. Able-bodied, invalid, or wounded soldiers, not one of them had been able to escape the most revolting and most ignominious treatment. To crown these horrible excesses of mob fury, the junta of Seville refused to recognize the capitulation, declared the French prisoners of war, and had them conducted to Cadiz, where they only reached after having faced 1,000 dangers, pillaged, robbed, insulted, and running the risk of being murdered every minute of the day. This disastrous day of Baylen, during which 20,000 French soldiers had marched past and laid down their arms before their enemies, who had always fled before them in the open field, was a reverse without example in the military history of the New France. It put a stain on our arms and dishonored the glory which till then they had enjoyed. It struck a most serious blow against our prestige in Spain. This unexpected success indeed electrified the Spaniards and dragged into the revolution those who were still hesitating. Napoleon was thunderstruck by this unexpected blow. A brave army had been struck by fate, and a spirit of dizziness had disabled its leaders. How, indeed, can so fatal an error be explained on the part of a general, General Dupont, whose military career had been most honorable and often brilliant, and for whom the emperor destined in the future a marshal's baton? On the part of another general officer of the highest merit, General Marescot, who till then had been esteemed and appreciated by Napoleon, and finally on the part of General Vidal, who had distinguished himself by brilliant feats of arms before Ulm and at Friedland, but whose misfortune it was to be too loyal to military discipline. To crown all, one of the emperor's equerries was one of the staff officers of this army and had been sent there on his request to enter the military service. His capacity as an officer of the imperial household had given him, in this deplorable occurrence, a role of confidence and a kind of ill-considered authority, which had been fatal. General Marescot, chief inspector of engineers, happened by chance to be at the headquarters of the Dupont Corps. Charged to reconnoitre the fort of Cadiz, he had been forced to follow the movements of this corps in consequence of the insurrection of the province of Seville. He was present at the affair at Baylen, and yielding to pressing instances, he had consented to undertake to negotiate for a capitulation. He had proceeded at once to Castaño's camp, dressed, it is said, in the Spanish uniform, for what reason is unknown, and had signed at the bottom of this shameful agreement a name which till then had been without reproach. The necessity of making an example forced the emperor to punish this general. He was dismissed from all his commissions. His wife shared his disgrace and lost her place as lady-in-waiting to the Empress Josephine. Although Napoleon felt very sorry to have to act with such severity towards a lady whom he esteemed, Madame Marescot was forced to understand that it was no longer impossible for her to remain at the palace any longer.